This week on the FOSS Pod, we're going to talk about the future of open source software.
Whoa, do we have a crystal ball?
Look, I've been doing this for a long time, Brad. I can see where we are. I know where we've been.
Hang on, is there an open source crystal ball library out there?
Oh, I bet there is. I bet there's a, hey, if you want a hologram in a crystal ball, there's probably an open source way to do that. But the point is, we've been doing this for a long time. We know where we came from. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We know where we are now. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And if you take those two things and combine them, you can make a pretty educated guess about what's going to happen next.
You're saying we're doing the past, the present, and the future?
That is exactly what I'm saying. And it's starting right now.
Wait, hang on. Does that mean, is this the Christmas Carol of open source?
No. That would be the, oh no, that is that. Wait, are you Jacob Marley or Ebenezer Scrooge?
I've always thought of myself more of a Bob Cratchit, but you know what? If I end up the Ebenezer Scrooge of open source software, I think I'll have to be okay with that.
Welcome to the FOSS Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
Brad, today we're talking about why we think open source is cool.
Oh, that seems like a good place to do that. Yes.
Yeah, this was our other episode 1 topic, but we figured, why not episode 3? It's the first real alone episode in the feed. And I think a good place to start for us maybe is origin stories. Because in a lot of ways, our computing history parallels the development of open source software over the last 20 years, 25 years now, 30 years.
Yeah. And then, this is how we kicked off the Tech Pod, is that we did kind of a general primer on our origin stories with computing and tech.
Yeah.
Also big fans of nonlinear time around here. So we figured we'd do this one in the middle somewhere.
Well, so for me, I was in college. I went to college in 93 and I took CS classes and worked on like Sun Microsystems workstations and stuff like that for those classes. But then I stopped taking CS classes and I just started kind of noodling with computers a little bit more on the side and got this magazine at the screwdriver shop near my school called Boot Magazine in 1996. I'd never seen a computer magazine. Like up until that point, computer magazines were pretty dry and businessy, and Boot was this. It was like a gamer magazine or a skate magazine, but it was about computers.
This ain't your dad's beige box, man. We're edgy here.
Literally, that was a thing that was said in that magazine on the reg. Yes.
Yes, I'm not surprised.
But I think later in 96, late 96, early 97, there was a feature in that magazine called, it was about alternate OSs. And they, did bits about such hits as BOS.
BOS, yes.
There was a section on Next. There was a section on basically they didn't have like an Irix section because you couldn't run Irix without buying an SGI workstation, but it was things you could install on your computer.
Irix? Irix. I
always called it Irix. I don't know.
I always thought it was Irix, but what do we know? We could not afford $50,000 workstations in the 90s. So,
well, I ended up having to maintain those when I worked IT shortly after I graduated from school. But anyway,
yeah, we're getting off the rails, but I'm very jealous that you got to work with a bunch of SGI workstations.
I assure you, there is absolutely nothing to be jealous of there because they were enormous pains to keep running.
As on that Boot magazine, like it kind of occurs to me like the 90s were a big time for alt stuff. Like we were kind of deep into alternative rock at that point. I wonder if that informed their alternative operating system thing.
Oh, 100%. Like I couldn't find, it turns out that copy of the magazine is lost to time. I looked on the internet at fair length to find it. I think I have a copy buried in my garage someplace, so I might go dig it out afterwards.
You should, do a public service. Like that is, you're quite literally contributing to the preservation of culture if you can find that magazine and put it online.
I don't have a scanner anymore, Brad. But also we could send it. We have people we can send it to who will put it on the old game archive, archive.org collections.
Yes, there are preservationists.
Anyway, the upshot was the magazine always came with a CD, and that issue of the magazine's CD had a handful of different Linux distros on it that you could install. And it was, at the time in the 90s, downloading a new OS was, it would have taken a long time. It was on a 28, I think I had ISDN or something at that point, but still you were downloaded at 64 kilobits per second. So downloading a couple of megs was a matter of hours, not moments or seconds as it would be now.
Wait, hang on. You had the slow ISDN?
At first I had slow ISDN and then I got fast ISDN.
Granted, even slow ISDN was very fast for the time, but
64 kilobits per second each way. And you could get a phone call. The neat thing about it, though, was somebody could call you and it would drop you from 128 to 64 and the phone would still ring without knocking you offline. Yeah, it was the future.
No more my dad yelling at me for taking up the phone line for 10 hours at a time.
Look, man, that Spirit of Christmas short wouldn't download itself, Brad.
You know what's funny is that you said that magazine is lost to time, but what I did find was a message on the Debian mailing list that survives to this day from 1997 about that issue from October, whatever it was, right there on Debian.org. I found a message somebody sent to that list. Is that a listserv, I guess you'd call that?
I guess so. It's also on the actual disk. The ISO of the disk is actually on archive.org. So if you want to download it and see what Slackware 2 or whatever it would have been, Slackware 96 would have been like, you can't. I don't know that I would encourage that behavior, but it's a thing you could do.
People have all kinds of niche interests these days.
So that was my entry point. I installed whatever version of I feel like it was probably Red Hat at that point, or maybe Slackware on my Pentium 90 or whatever computer I had in 1997. And then immediately was like, no, this isn't, like, I'm not ready for this. And I bought a copy of BOS. I was like, this is really cool. I can run 5 videos at once, and kind of, didn't come back to it for a long time at that point.
This operating system has a GUI. I know how to use this, which was not necessarily the case out of the box with Linux. You know what's funny? You just reminded me of is that I went to school. I went to NC State in '97 in Raleigh, North Carolina, which happens to be where Red Hat was based. And at the time, I had never heard of Red Hat before, but a friend's brother worked there and was just like, it's like, oh, my brother is doing really well at this like up and coming tech company called Red Hat. And I had no idea what they did, but they sounded important. And boy, they turned out to be.
Yeah, it turned out to be kind of a big deal. So like that was my entry. And then I didn't kind of like at that point in time, there wasn't a ton of Windows software that was open source, right? It like your browser, the guts of your browser probably were, I'd stopped using a Mosaic on Windows by that point and was using probably Netscape would be my guess in 96 or 97, and wouldn't start using Chromium or Firefox for a long time at that point. So it's funny because we talked about it a little bit in the intro, but at the same time I was reading Slashdot every day, kind of because it was like the geek news site, right? But that they also happened, like every other post was also about open source software and licensing and stuff like that.
Like Slashdot was where you went to find out when the next Phantom Menace trailer was going to hit.
Yeah, or I think I feel like probably one of the early Slashdot posts I saw was probably about like Star Wars getting re-released into theaters. And I saw that, I was like, oh, this is a cool site. I don't know what the Slashdot business is about, but I'll add this to this is going to go in my menu bar. I'm going to look at it every day.
Right. And in between all those posts about movies or whatever, or The Simpsons, there was a lot of stuff about a thing called Linux.
Yeah, well, there were also a lot of pictures about Microsoft with the picture of Bill Gates that was dressed up like a Borg. That was a popular thing.
Yes, there's some of those I call cultural elements have aged better than others, let's say. But okay, I'm just indulge me for a second here. I just want to throw out like a very quick fuzzy timeline of like the whole kind of Unix pantheon or lineage, just to set the stage.
Yeah, because like the temptation is to think that this all starts with Linux,
right?
And like the stuff that we know now, but it actually has been going on for a really long time.
Yeah, like I promise I'll try to keep this to 60 seconds. But like, so like Unix started like what in the late 60s, early 70s, mainly at AT&T as kind of a research project.
Yeah, the Bell Labs, right?
Right, Bell Labs, like Unix being basically the grandfather of all modern operating systems in one way or another. Late 70s, I want to say, is when Berkeley, Cal Berkeley, UC Berkeley, got into the whole thing with BSD, the Berkeley Software Distribution. Like, I think there were copyright issues there, I want to say, that led to them essentially kind of developing their own Unix. Fast forward through the whole 80s, I think we don't talk about the 80s. I mean, that's when like the GNU scene started, and there were kind of some aborted attempts to make a free Unix variant.
Well, I was going to say there was an interesting thing that happened in the 80s where like the idea that software should not be open became the dominant idea, because that wasn't the case up until that point.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, like this is getting a little off topic, but not too off topic. But if you're familiar with Robert Evans' podcast Behind the Bastards, he did a 2-parter on Bill Gates, and that's actually one of the main points of that long. I mean, it's like 3-4 hours of podcast, but like maybe the biggest takeaway from that thing is how much pre-Microsoft computing was an open, hobbyist, communal, shared thing, right? Like Steve Wozniak is the counter example, right?
Yeah.
Woz just wanted to design cool computers and literally give those schematics away to other people to build them themselves if they wanted to. Early Microsoft benefited enormously from the open work that was being done in computing, and then they turned around and closed all of their stuff, which was not necessarily a nice way to give back.
I think probably all of those early computer, like the 80s computer companies, were in a similar situation. It's just Microsoft was better at it than everybody else.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, these were all going to become Fortune 500 companies one way or another, I guess. But like it does make you realize, looking back at like the origins of Unix, but also like the early kind of Silicon Valley hacker homebrew computer club scene, like the origins of computing very much are rooted in what is now the open source philosophy, right? Of we are smart, passionate people that want to make cool stuff and share it with everybody. And like that's kind of what free and open source software is today, right?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental idea that, hey, this foundational work has been done and it's accessible to everyone. So now you can build at the highest level, at the top layer, instead of having to build everything up to get to that top layer and then build your thing, is a really key thing. We'll talk about it in a little bit, I think. But
yeah. Anyway, so I promised this would be 60 seconds. But so, like you had original Unix and the BSD stuff, but then there were attempts in the 80s that didn't really pan out to make like a quote unquote truly free Unix. But then early 90s is where that stuff actually really happened, right? Linux came out in, I think, 91. The first Linux, which is like Linux is a fully separate thing from Unix. It was written from scratch to be very much like Unix. I mean, like, the term Unix-like is very commonly used today. And then FreeBSD is the other biggest surviving kind of open source Unix descendant, which is still out there. I mean, it is a small fraction of the size of Linux at this point, but it does underpin things like Mac OS and like the modern PlayStation consoles. Like there's FreeBSD code is all over the place.
iOS, a lot of embedded systems too.
Yes, a lot of basically all of Apple's stuff and the PlayStations and the TCP/IP stack in Windows originally was based on FreeBSD code, it turns out. But Linux, obviously, by far the biggest current modern Unix-like that is out there. But I just wanted to put a little historical context on what we're talking about. That like you got Linux in 91, and then you're talking like what 96, 97. It was about the same for me when we started becoming aware of this stuff and touching it a little bit.
That was when things like the Windows managers, GNOME and KDE and stuff like that started coming online and getting to the point you could use them. And that was when. And it also coincided for me personally with the time when I had like a lot of free time.
The exotic GUI, I feel like, was the gateway for every young nerd with too much time on their hands to want to tinker with stuff, to see screenshots of a UI that was not Windows 95 and go like, ooh, that looks cool. They're doing stuff I can't do. I want to try that.
It was also nice because the tools for remoting into the machines in the computer labs were easier on Linux. So you could running Cygwin was a pain, but just connecting your X client to an X server on another machine was pretty easy. And so there was an opportunity to noodle there that ended up in retrospect, it was probably easier to just, grab my bike and ride down to the computer lab.
Sure.
But, here we are. So what was your, I guess, first kind of entry point for your Unixing, Brad?
My first hands-on experience with Linux was installing Slackware. I downloaded some version of Slackware probably circa 1997. I had a Pentium 75. I downloaded a version of Slackware that you could put onto floppies and install from floppy.
How many
I don't remember. I think it was guessing 6 or 8 floppies, maybe a dozen. I really can't quite remember.
Okay. But it's multiple hours of downloading probably.
Yes, that was a lot. It was a major endeavor, a multi-day endeavor, and I formatted my hard drive to try it. I literally just wiped Windows and was like, I'm just going to do this Linux thing. And back then, you installed Linux and it just dumped you into a bash prompt with like nothing, right? Like, it's not like you had another computer well, I guess, you could have probably bought a reference book. If I had been a little more enterprising, I probably could have gone to the Walden Books and found a, Linux for Dummies or something similar. But like, without a lot of resources around the edges, like there was kind of nothing I could do with it, right? I couldn't get it to work with my modem without any kind of help, so I couldn't connect to the internet and look up like how-tos or guides.
That was a common early Slashdot topic, is host-based modems suck, the category.
So yes, like it was just kind of I'm in a prompt that looks a lot like DOS, now what? And there was no follow-up to the now what, so after a day or two, I just formatted and went back to Windows. And then I kind of just stuck on Windows. I was playing a lot of games and stuff at the time until I got to college and ended up in one of the very few remaining dorms on campus that did not have wired Ethernet.
Oh, wow. See, I was on the other end of that. When I was living on campus, there was one dorm with wired Ethernet and nothing else had it. So
no kidding.
Yeah. It's a 5-year swing there.
So out of like 20 something dorms, there were 3 remaining without Ethernet, and I got one of them. Anyway, that led to me spending a ton of time in the computer labs at NC State, which were full of mid-90s Sun Sparcstations running Solaris, which Solaris was kind of Sun's own variant of Unix, which I think was closed source at the time technically. It was not technically open source at the time, but it was a Unix. And being in those computer labs, I mean, that's an engineering school, and there were computer labs everywhere. Like practically every other building had a lab. And it was my first experience with having a user login and a home directory.
Oh, that was shared on a server someplace and not tied to the machine. Yeah.
That was divorced from like a physical machine. And I thought it was the coolest thing in the world that I could literally walk into any lab on campus and just type in my username and password, and like there was my desktop. There were all my files, like something about that felt so exotic and futuristic to me after years on crappy old versions of Windows, right?
It was the time of the thin client, right? That's when Sun was saying, look, the future of computing is going to be a bunch of stuff hosted online, and we're all just going to use these really lightweight terminals to connect to that.
Right.
And people took it seriously for a little bit, and then it became a subject of mockery. And now it's how we actually interact with a lot of computing with like phones and web-based cloud servers. And anyway.
Yeah, like in retrospect, it's less that they made the wrong bet and more that they were just like 15 to 20 years too early, it seems like, because it very much has wrapped back around to kind of satisfy that vision.
And I think that their vision of the thin client didn't align with what phones ended up being, right?
Yeah, I mean, what, you don't like a computer that looks like a pizza box?
Well, and also my phone is 10 times as fast as any of those. Anyway.
I will say before we move on real quick, the hanging out in those computer labs was also my introduction to the idea that you could do stuff with the command line besides format a disk, I guess I would say. Think about how limited DOS was, right? Unless you had like expensive hardware and really knew what you were doing, all you were doing in DOS was like either running a DOS program or launching Windows, right? Multimedia was very much the domain of Windows to people who didn't have a lot of computing experience at the time.
That's true. Yeah.
Hanging out in that lab was my introduction to like, I can play MP3s, which by the way, this was like also the dawn of MP3s. But it was like, I can play an audio file from a command line utility. That's insane. I had no idea you could do that. I can access the internet, hang out on IRC. I can read Usenet boards. Internet access and multimedia stuff from the command line was like something I didn't even realize was possible until I got into that world.
It's true, because I guess I used shell accounts when I was remoting into the internet for the first like 2 years I was on the internet. Like I didn't have a direct connect, a PPP. I didn't have a Windows TCP/IP stack that was connected to the internet through a dial-up connection until like 1995. So the first couple of years I was on the internet, it was mostly logging into the remote fax or Unix machines and, running command line tools there. So that was my whole experience. But those pipes were slow enough that you couldn't do things like play audio across them. And like it was a different time, but also even then you could still run multiple programs on those shell accounts at the same time just by opening up another bash prompt or whatever your prompt was. I don't even remember what I used then. So after all that, I went to work at Maximum PC in 2000. So in 2004, I said in a feature pitch meeting, hey, why don't I run Linux for a year and see how that goes on my work machine?
A whole year?
I did it for a year.
In the office?
In the office.
Jeez.
Well, so I was the technical editor when this started, and as a result, I didn't have to use the Adobe stuff. So I didn't have a license for InDesign or Photoshop or Illustrator, or any of the stuff that we actually use to do graphics and layout in the magazine. So mostly my work was Word and then like some really light photo editing, but I mostly used PaintShop Pro or something else for that at the time. So nothing in my daily workflow required. We were still using IMAP email at that point. We hadn't moved to an Exchange client or Google or anything at that point. So nothing I was using required an x86 client, and I could just move my Firefox profile over to the Linux machine and my Thunderbird profile over to the Linux machine, and I'd be good to go. So I did it. I installed Debian. I set it up on my normal desktop machine. I had a Windows and a Debian partition for a while, and then I wiped the Windows partition after a couple of weeks when I was pretty comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to do this experiment, you got to go all the way.
That's the thing. The initial thought was that if the first part of that went well, I'd move my Windows PC at home over too, and we bailed on that because I did have to review games for work, so I wasn't able to do any testing with that because it didn't seem fair to review games on Wine or WineX, whatever the variant was at the time. But yeah, so I documented it in a diary for a year, and a lot of it was like learning how to breaking X, or the window X is the Windows. like the X is at the time was the software that turned the command line into a graphical user interface with windows that you could move around and stuff like that.
Yeah, like even getting my head around that paradigm was weird coming from Windows, because obviously Windows doesn't care or doesn't make you care about anything about how the graphics stack works to make the GUI render on the screen. And then yes, coming to the open source world, it's like, wait, okay, so X is the graphics server essentially is what you're saying, and then the window manager is what sits on top of that and actually controls how the windows are drawn. Is that right? Like, there's a lot to learn there for sure.
Well, yeah, like the Windows manager controls like the Chrome, like all the bars, right, and where the close window button is and stuff like that.
I think it's what is called a desktop environment these days, I think is the preferred term. But back then it was window managers. And these days it's like GNOME and KDE Plasma, which is what the Steam Deck uses. We'll talk about that stuff later. But
it's funny reading this article now, and we'll post a link in the notes to an archive on either archive.org or Google Books.
Wait, are you sure you want people to see you wearing this penguin suit?
I'm fine with that. Yeah, I have no shame. But yeah, like a lot of it is, hey, how did I get the desktop renderer working? Do I install the closed source 3D graphics card drivers, or do I install the open source ones that don't do any 3D acceleration for the UI stuff?
Oh my God, here is a section entitled Using Nano to Configure X Windows. And you straight up have monospace font lines from your, let's see, which config file is that?
It's XF86 config.
Right. Yes, XF86 config. Right. Yes, of course.
Yeah. So it was like the point of this wasn't to necessarily teach people how to install Linux and use it. It was to show the work that went in. Like, it was just to say, hey, there was a bunch of stuff in here. Figuring out how to connect to our domain at work was really hard. I had to install some CIFS fork, and it was really interesting. It turns out though that like running Thunderbird and Firefox in a world where not everything lived in a web browser yet, having Thunderbird and Firefox were still really, really important, because I was able to use most of the web. There were a handful of Microsoft specific things that used like ActiveX controls that didn't work. But then figuring out how to connect to the domain and get to the file shares where all of our work files were stored was a multi-day problem. Figuring out how to get cups working so I could print to the 3 different printers that I had to use was a challenge. But by the end of the year, I was at a point where everything worked that I needed to do on the day-to-day. And then I got promoted and had to use InDesign on the Mac, and they gave me a G5, and I was like, well, okay, I'm probably good now.
Guess that's that.
Yeah.
Little did you know that even underneath the Mac OS you were using at the time was open source software.
The big thing that's changed in the last 20 years, it turns out, is that Linux is a lot more approachable now.
A lot more approachable.
And also, open source is everywhere.
Yes. And it kind of took over the world. It quietly, steadily has taken over the world, which is why we're doing this podcast.
I remember them saying on Slashdot in the 90s, oh, open source is going to eat the world. And it seemed like a kind of thing that like maybe people a little bit on the fringe of a movement would say.
Yeah. Everybody seems like a lunatic until they're proven right.
Yeah, no, they were right. If you heard that last segment and were like, oh, I want to experiment with Linux, the thing to know is you don't have to wipe your computer anymore to do it. You can download a free virtual machine manager that runs inside Windows or Mac OS, and will let you install an ISO and get a fully fledged Linux desktop running inside your other computer.
Yeah. Or I do this. You can, just about every major Linux distro has a version that will boot from a USB stick at this point, non-destructively. To be clear, it won't touch anything on your main computer's storage devices. It's not going to overwrite your Windows install.
Unless you tell it to.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can, obviously, if you want to go all the way, but it uses all your hardware. It's like you can boot up the same machine, same graphics card, same everything, but on Linux, basically. It's like I actually keep an Ubuntu Live USB in my drawer at all times. Just like occasionally you'll run into a thing you want to do that only runs on Linux, and it's super easy or super handy to be able to just plug that into my Windows desktop and reboot into Linux and do the thing I need to do for 5 minutes. Also, the driver support, like you just cannot overstate how much better the driver support is than it was 15, 20 years ago. I mean, like you were saying earlier with file sharing and stuff like that, like the early Linux experience for the first several years was like a multi-day process of banging your head against like, how do I get my Ethernet card to work? How do I get my sound card to work? Like nothing works. And again, with something like those Ubuntu bootable sticks, like everything just works, like the driver support is robust enough now that you literally just boot off that thing and it's like, okay, I've got network, I've got sound, like it's just there in a very Windows-like fashion.
It's funny, we're talking about Linux a lot here, but Linux desktop is the one place that this is not true. I mean, Android and iOS, Mac OS all have underpinnings of open source software, right? Like the kernels are all open source software, and then the thing that you think of as your iPhone or your Android phone live on top of that in a closed source kind of way. The things like routers, now every consumer router that you buy, the thing that you plug in between your cable modem and the rest of the internet of the network in your house, is running an open source kernel and an open source OS with like a web front end on top of it, or an app front end that connects to some API that was built on top of the open source software. Even like drones, like the most popular drone controllers in the world for hobbyist and like low end professional grade drones are running open source software. CAD, like all sorts of open source CAD stuff has been built up. A lot of the cam controls that control the computer assisted manufacturing machines like laser cutters and 3D printers and stuff like that, that's all open source now.
The one I find supremely amusing for some reason is cars.
Wait, cars?
Even cars run Linux.
I don't feel great about that one.
There's literally something called the Automotive Linux Summit. Like they literally have a conference, a trade event specifically around the automotive industry's use of Linux in
it's
cars.
not the self-driving cars. It's just the stuff the software that like the yes. engines and the dashboard units and all that stuff runs.
Yes, and I would assume increasingly things like the user-facing kind of embedded entertainment systems in cars and stuff like that, I would guess as well.
I think one of the big success stories for open source over the last 15, 20 years has been the rise of embedded systems. And when we say embedded systems, we do mean like the software that makes the software you see run. So the phones are kind of good example, but like routers, if your refrigerator has a screen, there's probably Linux under that. You often will go into the about this software and or licensing page on whatever embedded system you're running, and it'll say, oh yeah, this includes GPL software for the full source. You can go to blah 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 and grab the source code here.
I mean, that's true of video games increasingly. Like that's something that I have been delighted by over time as a gigantic nerd for stuff like this, is the number of times you boot up a game these days and just have a like kind of view licenses option at the main screen where you can go look at all the open source libraries that they use to help build the game on. Like it's fun to see.
And the reason it works is the thing we touched on a little bit before, but it is, if you're sitting down to build a complicated piece of software and you have to start with what do I have to do to get this silicon to run any code at all, and then build from there, it's going to take you a lot longer time to build your product and build the thing that you want to build than it is if you say, okay, I have a working machine here and all I have to do, I have APIs that let me connect to cameras and sound and network and screens and mice and keyboards and all the other touch screens, all the other devices you might want to interact with. Your spin up time, it's like the difference between building a video game from scratch and starting with the Unreal or the Unity engine. And it's a powerful concept.
I guess a good way to think about it is like there are a bunch of free building blocks out there, right? Like it's a bunch of like self-contained pieces that you can use to, obviously you have to do a ton of your own work to make this happen, but like, if you're building a game, it's like, oh, I need, I need a font renderer and like I need, file compression, decompression routines. And it's like, oh, you can just go pull libraries off of the internet that are free for use as long as you comply with the licensing terms. You don't have to build your own font renderer. You can use this one as long as you make the source available.
We're going to talk about Slashdot a lot here, but that was a lot of the early open source coverage when Linksys released a router that had an open source OS, and then they didn't release appropriate source code. The communities that contributed to that were upset, and there was legal action taken, right? Because it was conceptually new for a lot of the companies doing this work, and they didn't know how to comply with the license requirements. And at the same time, like the license requirements were in flux and not necessarily legally, like a lot of them weren't legally sound. Like there were requirements that you couldn't use the software for evil, but not using it for evil, it turns out, is not a legally defined term, and that means that the validity of the license in question was maybe up in the air. Okay, so where we're at now, servers, embedded systems, things like Chromebooks, like every school, not every school kid, but a lot of school kids get Chromebooks assigned when they go to school. Or if you want a cheap laptop that's just for checking your email and staying connected when you're away from home. They're amazing little devices. They're just Linux with a Chromium front end, basically. airline seats. There's open source software running on the Perseverance rover.
Yes, on Mars.
Because the flight controller for the helicopter is open source.
It's everywhere. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, like if it is a thing in the world that runs infrastructure, there is almost certainly some type of open source software like centrally involved in that.
And we've started to see this bleed over into stuff that normal people use, like not software that runs the software that normal people use, but we're starting to see open source be the software that normal people use. So things like OBS and Home Assistant and MAME and FFmpeg or VLC. So VLC is a perfect example of this, right? It's become, over the last 10, 15 years, the de facto video player for pretty much any computer that it can run on.
Anytime I have a new Windows install or setting up a new MacBook, as I've done recently, like VLC is one of the first things I go download and just set all of the file associations to it immediately.
And it's because it plays literally any video you can throw at it, from something that was encoded 25 years ago to like brand new codecs that like aren't even in wide circulation yet. It supports and it will play.
That's exactly it. Like that's one of the things I love about a lot of, especially the media oriented open source software I use, is that open source types really they really care about standards. Like they really care about file format standards, codec standards, protocol standards, like all of the core technologies that make everything in computing work. They always have a very deep, comprehensive understanding of that stuff. And so you always get the best support for stuff like that in an open source project like VLC.
And then a couple of years ago, Microsoft finally moved away from using their own proprietary web renderer or HTML renderer. And as a result, all of the browsers you can use now, or at least all of the mainstream ones, are based on open source renderers.
Yes, Chromium and WebKit, I feel like, are great core technology examples of open source. Chromium is associated with mostly with Chrome, you might be surprised to hear, and WebKit is primarily an Apple and Safari thing. But yeah, like the rendering engines that make the pages work in those browsers are all open source at this point. Anybody can look at that code and contribute. Oh, and then of course Firefox. I mean, Firefox in a lot of ways is the original kind of open source browser at a time when the others were not. So we would be remiss in not mentioning that.
I don't think we need to talk about OBS anymore, since we did a whole episode about it, but like OBS is another perfect example. All of the vast majority of people who are streaming to Twitch, YouTube, all of the places that people do live video, they're for the most part using OBS at this point. And it's because it's become the thing that is the good one, not just the thing that is available freely. So it's been a fascinating decade. And I think we both think at this point that is going to continue accelerating into the consumer space. So
yeah, there's still a little bit of a divide to me between, like, there are a ton of applications like the ones we've talked about. There's Audacity, Blender. I mean, the list goes on and on, but those are compiled for Windows and Mac. They are packaged for those operating systems. You can just download an installer, a DMG, whatever, and just use them, right? They have GUIs. Like, functionally, as far as the end user is concerned, it doesn't matter that it's open source because it's packaged and available and usable in the same way that closed source applications also are for the operating system. But then there's this whole other ecosystem out there of software on GitHub and other software version control platforms that like are not at that level of usability yet, right? But they do a lot of cool stuff. It does require a lot of technical knowledge to access that stuff. Like, I don't know if we'll get there, but that's the kind of thing that I would love to like bridge that gap for people who listen to this podcast ultimately, is like people who use, say, OBS and Audacity and Blender and stuff like that now to, hey, I'm going to go dig into this repo on GitHub and like maybe build this software myself. Maybe that's a lofty goal. You tell me if that's ambitious, but like I really enjoyed getting to that place, and I would love to be able to bring more people there.
On top of that, the more people that get to that place, the more people say, oh, hey, it would be neat if this thing was built into such and such, or it would be better if this software did this, right? And that's how things like OBS happened. That's how Audacity happened. Somebody sat down and was like, oh man, I would love to have an audio editor, but I don't want to have to pay $300 for, audio editor X. And they said, oh, I think I know how to do most of this stuff. Let's put it together. And they posted, and somebody else said, oh, I know how to do this other part. And 10 years later, you have a really fully featured piece of software. We're at the point now where that's happening, right? Like, there are more and more of those every day. And whether it's vector graphics with something like Inkscape or CAD CAM stuff there's so many open CAD programs, because CAD programs are so expensive and frequently janky and in kind of like ways that are a little bit scary until you start paying for the really, really, really phenomenally expensive versions. So Yeah, I'm excited about the future, and I think that's what we should talk about next.
Okay, Will, we've arrived at the future. What do you got?
I think, Brad, that we are at an inflection point.
Oh, I love those. That's when everything changes.
It is. I think we're going to see the same explosion of open source software for normal people. And we're starting to see like the very hints of it. And I'm not talking about, like I said before, the stuff that runs underneath the software that you use. I think we're actually going to see like there are pieces of complicated, what would currently be proprietary applications being built in the open source world in a way that the open source software is really visible. Like the Steam Deck, for example, is a perfect example of this.
Yes, Steam Deck being a Valve's lavishly powerful and equipped new video game handheld that plays PC games, just like your desktop PC does. But yes, that thing runs Linux, like underneath everything, Arch Linux even, which is a pretty hardcore distro.
But if you think about it, if you were being reductive, you would say it is a Nintendo Switch, but for PC games.
Yeah.
And while it's designed to run closed source software, the platform, what they're doing is replicating something that was a expensive to develop proprietary platform with open hardware and open software. And that to me is the essence of what this next phase of open source software for consumers looks like, right? You know, think about your Google Nest Hub, right? It's a little screen that sits in your kitchen and it shows you pictures from Google Photos, and it uses Google's voice recognition software to take commands, and it connects to Google's webcam or security camera infrastructure. And you have this lovely little Google, it's a screen for all the Google stuff in your house. But the pieces to build that in the open source world exist now. There's open source voice recognition that uses fancy machine learning that does a really good job of natural language parsing. There's front ends in tools like Home Assistant and probably a bunch of stuff that I don't even know about that will let you display what you want on that screen. And you can hook video feeds from cameras around your house into that kind of stuff too. So like it's just at the point where people have to realize that they want these applications and then go out and build them and assemble them and work with hardware vendors to get the pieces together.
I feel like cool gadgets around the house is a good category where you can see this starting to happen already. Like if you go out and Google the phrase smart mirror,
yeah,
like I don't think there are any like fancy branded, like nicely packaged consumer smart mirror products out there yet. They may be on the way, or maybe there's one I haven't seen, but like there are all kinds of DIY smart mirror projects out there that like are fairly approachable. Like it's, you know, you need a Raspberry Pi and like a monitor and like there is some assembly required, some open source software knowledge required, but like it's like doable for the average person to go out and follow one of these smart mirror guides. And to be clear, a smart mirror is like, would you call it like a Minority Report style? Like it's a mirror that has a bunch of like very cool looking floating graphical information on it. Like it looks like a thing out of something like Minority Report where special effects are required to achieve this effect, but it's right there on your mirror.
It turns out all you have to do is take whatever the back plane is off of your mirror, the thing that keeps the light from coming in the back, and then put something that's emissive behind it, and it works itself out.
Yeah, like it looks nice. It's a really tasteful, like kind of illuminated text and graphics kind of showing through the mirror as you're doing your hair in the morning or whatever. But like the point is, like that looks like something that would be delivered for, I don't know, $500 from some major electronics manufacturer, right?
Yeah.
But like here people have just figured out how to do it themselves, and like the parts are out there. Information is out there. You can kind of just go for it. I feel like the voice recognition stuff you've brought up though is like that's the example that really illustrated the point for me.
Yeah, there are a bazillion open source frameworks for like machine learning assisted voice recognition. Are they as far along and as, you know, kind of application-y as loading up AWS or Google or whoever your cloud provider is and tapping into one of their voice acceleration APIs and doing your stuff that way? Probably not.
Or not yet.
I mean, that's the thing is we're at the point where this stuff is becoming possible and where the open alternatives to the closed proprietary software are in the kind of the sweet spot of that acceleration and growth curve where you know the hockey stick starts to shape. It's not flat anymore. It's not horizontal anymore. It's starting to go vertical. And once it gets vertical, then all sorts of things happen.
Yeah, and in that specific case, like that seems like pretty rapid progress from, I forget which year Siri debuted, but it hasn't been that long, right? It's within the last decade that this kind of like digital assistant voice recognition stuff even became a thing at all.
It's absolutely the case. Yeah. And it really just got good when the hardware acceleration landed with like the iPhone 10, kind of like the 2015, 2016 era phones. So
generally the idea of these like advanced technologies that are assumed to be the domain of giant corporations selling very expensive luxury consumer goods becoming democratized by like having the building blocks, the really low level kind of information processing, machine learning, like the guts or the brain, I should say, of that whole experience, like just existing out there and being available for normal people is super exciting.
Well, and there's still, with machine learning technology, there's always the problem of data, which is you have to have massive data sets to train on something that's as complex as, say, natural language parsing or voice recognition or image recognition. But those problems are actually being solved. It's taken a little bit longer for the more open environments to reach that point, but we're getting there as a collective. So I think to me that's the exciting thing about the future of at least consumer open source. I mean, look, people listening to this are screaming at their radios in the cars right now. What about the Linux desktop? What about the Linux desktop?
Okay, it's 2022.
Yeah.
Is it the year?
Brad, I got bad news for you, buddy.
Still not the year?
Look, I think my take on this is that secretly the year of the Linux desktop was like whatever year they started putting Chromebooks in every elementary school in the country.
That's fair, I guess.
I mean, look, you're not running GNOME, I don't think. Maybe you are, who knows? But like that is the Linux desktop that the world deserves if it isn't the Linux desktop that the world needs.
Sure. I mean, obviously it is fairly limited in its use case, and especially limited as we talked about earlier in terms of how much Linux it actually exposes. But like, I don't know, to me, like Linus Tech Tips doing that experiment they ran.
Which experiment did they run, Brad?
It's kind of whether they could all switch over to Linux as their daily driver, or maybe not all of them, but like that is a massively popular YouTube channel who is getting out here and saying like, hey, we're going to try this. We're going to try migrating entirely from Windows to a Linux machine and see how it goes.
How did it go?
I don't know that they made the switch permanently.
So yeah, so that's it. That's where we are. That's why we were excited about doing an open source podcast, open source software podcast. It's why I'm excited about open source personally, is because the big projects that combine a bunch of work that touches like Home Assistant is a perfect example of this. Honestly, the Mister, even though the target audience is a niche of a niche of a niche, the Mister is a good example too, because they both take massive surface area and apply a lot of people working on these large problems to give coverage well beyond what even most corporate entities could in the same space. So it's a really exciting time to be into open source, which is why we're doing this podcast. Mm-hmm. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please go over to fosspod.content.town and mash that subscribe button. We will be here every other week. I think that's bi-weekly, but it's unclear to me what bi-weekly even means anymore.
Let's just go with it.
Yeah, it's a bi-weekly show, so we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. You may, if you're finding this for the first time, you may also like the Tech Pod, which is the other technology podcast that Brad and I do, which is about all sorts of technology, not just open source stuff. It is at techpod.content.town. And we have to thank our generous sponsors, Google's open source group. They say, we bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. So thank you, Google's open source group. You can find out more about them at opensource.google. Nothing else.
Yep.
Just .google.
That's right. They got their own top level domain and everything.
Somebody said we should get .content as a top level domain.
Wait, we control all of the content on the internet?
I mean, I think that would make us the lords of content. Yeah.
I like this. like the sound of that.
I don't, it seems like a lot of responsibility though. I don't know.
Great power, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all for listening, Brad. Always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend.
Same to you. Thank you very much.
And we will see everybody in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening.